created in response to the 1968 protests at Columbia in order to give students a platform to express themselves and in order to increase dialogue between opposing ideologies. Today, the SGB recognizes the Columbia University College Republicans, the Columbia Political Union, and hopefully, starting next semester, the American Enterprise Institute, which has started their recognition process right now. We are proud that our groups are hosting such events in order to increase the dialogue on this campus. The Student Governing Board's core value is to protect freedom of speech on our campus. Our Constitution states that we must represent the student body in all of its diversity. We believe that ideas from every part of the political spectrum can be labeled as dangerous, and thus, this cannot be a reason for silencing and censorship. By allowing ideas to be expressed, we are creating space for them to be challenged, and this dialogue is crucial for students on this campus to learn and grow. The Student Governing Board, however, is also committed to uplifting the voices of students. We therefore defend and stand by those who want to express their opposition to the views being presented to them by speakers that are given platforms here. Attempts to suppress dissent are as dangerous to free speech as attempts to censor the speakers that are speaking to us today. Because our speaker's voice is neither more valuable nor more legitimate than the voices of our students, we value the challenging of our speaker's view through open letters, questions and answers, and even nonviolent disruptions of the talk, as long as it does not lead to a complete silencing of the speaker or a safety issue. Those values are honorable, but I want to quote what President Bollinger said during his address introducing Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. This event has nothing to do with the right of the speaker, but only with our right to listen and speak. We do it for ourselves. I will personally not listen to Mr. Murray's talk tonight. His work has been debunked by numerous scholars and is insulting to the intellectual integrity that I believe Columbia has taught me. I hope the rest of you approach his ideas critically. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Shaz-Mizrahi. I'm a member of Columbia's American Enterprise Institute Executive Council, as well as Columbia University College Republicans. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to thank the members of CUCR, AEI Executive Council, and CPU for their hard work in organizing this event. I would also like to thank the Columbia Administration and the American Enterprise Institute for their guidance and assistance in making this event a success. Finally, I would like to thank everyone in attendance for joining us tonight and choosing to engage with these important ideas. At the conclusion of the talk, there will be a question and answer session. When this time arrives, we ask that you line up behind the mic in the middle row, and we request that you keep your questions concise and respectful. Dr. Murray received his BA from Harvard University in 1971 and his PhD in political science from MIT in 1979. He is currently the W.H. Brady Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Prior to working at AEI, he was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Dr. Murray first came to national attention in 1984 with the publication of Losing Ground, which has been credited as the intellectual foundation for the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. His other books include the 1994 New York Times bestseller, The Bell Curve, What It Means to Be a Libertarian, Human Accomplishment, In Our Hands, Real Education, and of course, Coming Apart, which is the topic of our discussion tonight. Dr. Murray's talk this evening is titled, Are Elites to Blame for the Rise of Donald Trump? He's joining us to discuss the ways in which cultural division resulted in the election of Donald Trump this past November. Now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to this evening's speaker, Dr. Charles Murray.
Well, we can all relax now. Nothing exciting is going to happen, I don't think. The talk tonight is about the relationship of Trump to the topics that I talked about in Coming Apart. I am not going to be talking about Hillary Clinton's emails. I'm not going to be talking about how many campaign visits were made by the campaigners to the blue wall states in the week before the election. All of the tactical issues I am clueless about, and if you read my Twitter feed over the year before he was elected, you will see I was wrong about everything regarding Donald Trump and his fortunes. But I think that the election of Donald Trump was, in some sense, I won't say inevitable, but it is a product of strategic forces that were extremely powerful indeed. I'm going to spend about the first half hour of this presentation talking about those forces and how they played out. I'm going to spend the last 10 minutes talking about the second theme of the talk, which is I think that the election of 2016 marked the end of creedal America. And I'll explain what I mean by creedal America when I get to it. Let's start with the two large forces that I think explain a great deal. The first of these was a revolution in the people who went to college from 1950 to 1960, and that continued after 1960 and permeated the entire college system. And by that I mean a good thing that happened. And by the way, this is going to be a theme throughout the talk. I'm going to be talking about forces that have had a lot of unhappy consequences that arose from people not only doing what came naturally, but people actually doing the right thing in many cases, and institutions doing the right thing. And what happened to colleges in the 1950s and thereafter is a classic example. What happened was that they became much more efficient at identifying talent wherever it existed and drawing it into elite colleges. I'm sure it happened at Columbia, because it happened everywhere else. I can give you specific numbers for Harvard College, where I went. In 1952, the mean SAT verbal score for incoming Harvard freshmen was 583. Nothing to write home about. 8 years later, 1960, the mean SAT verbal score was 678. Essentially, over a period of 8 years, you've gone up one standard deviation in the verbal score. You'd also gone up about a standard deviation in the math score. The average Harvard freshman in 1952 would have been close to the bottom decile of the Harvard class of 1960. That's a huge change, and it was for the better insofar as Harvard was transforming itself from a place with a lot of rich kids, some of whom were smart, to a place with a lot of smart kids, some of whom were rich. I was the beneficiary of that. I came to Harvard in the fall of 1961. Your years were off on my degrees, 65 for the BA and 74 for the PhD. Anyway, I came in the fall of 1961, and I came from Newton, Iowa. There is no way that 20 years before I would have ever considered going to any place but University of Iowa or Iowa State. So that's good that you're drawing in talent from all over the country, but it also changed the nature of the culture of the places where this happened, because first you had a college population that was growing very rapidly at that point. Here's a statistic. As of late as 1950, even with the GI Bill and all that, only 15% of 23-year-olds were getting BAs in 1950, only 15%, which means, if you think about it, that the great majority of really high IQ people in the country were not getting college degrees. By 1960, that process had started to change. By 1970, 1980, 1990, the proportion of people in the top decile of IQ who were getting college degrees had approached not 100%, it was in the 90%. And the proportion who were still in the general population who had IQs of 130 or 140 and were not getting college degrees had become very small. In addition to the raw number of college graduates, high school graduates going to college, these were sorted within colleges, with the elite colleges getting more and more separated from the rest of the country in terms of the nature of their student bodies. This had a couple of consequences with profound social significance. One is it changed the nature of assortative mating that went on, homogamy. Now, historically, there has always been a substantial correlation between IQ of two married partners. It has been a very natural thing to happen because the fact is you want to marry somebody who gets your jokes. You want to marry someone who you don't have to explain what you mean, that they know what you meant. It's actually wise to marry someone who is smarter than you, I would add, because then you absolutely can be certain that in the case of a man like me, that your wife understands you. This is usually a good thing. It makes for a happy marriage. Sometimes it's more problematic. In any case, the assortative mating changed. You had the correlation all along. It's in the region of 0.4 to 0.5, but the pool from which this was happening was different. So you can have a correlation of 0.4 between married partners, but it could still be that one partner is way above the other. It just is that there is a correlation. Once you got this kind of stratification, cognitive stratification in colleges, think about the ways in which the choice of who you married, the pool of those persons changed. So if you were let's say, a highly successful male in 1950, you become the CEO of a company, let's say, who were you married to? Point number one is you probably got married in your early 20s. That's when people got married. Point number two is you probably married the girl next door, figuratively or literally. So she may have been smarter than the average person, but she wasn't selected for IQ. Who is the CEO of a company marrying now? Well, first place, he probably got married in his 30s. And he has his MBA from Stanford, and he have suit drawn up against his company. And when he meets the litigators who are prosecuting him or issuing the complaint, one of them is a very attractive woman who got her law degree from Yale. That she is thrown in contact with, both in college and thereafter in his career, with extremely talented women, and it's from that pool that he chooses. That has consequences in the nature of their children. You don't have to get into the question of IQ and genes and heritability and all that. All you have to know is that the correlation of children's IQs with their parents' IQs is also in the region of 0.5. Whether that's for genetic reasons or for the way they were raised is not germane. The fact is IQ is passed down. Now, it is also true you have regression to the mean. So if you have two parents with IQs of 130, the average IQ of their kids is going to be about 115. But if you say, where is the next generation of people coming from who have IQs of 130 that will be thrown off primarily by those kinds of couples? So that's one consequence. The second consequence is that you got the critical mass for a new kind of culture. Let me go back to the experience at Harvard. I'm sure that there were counterparts here at Columbia. In 1961, when I got to Harvard, when you walked outside the gates of Harvard Yard, you were in a lower middle class New England town, Cambridge, Massachusetts. There were a lot more bookstores within walking distance of Harvard than there are in the ordinary working class / middle class community. But aside from that, there were hardly any place that was any good to eat. A few Chinese restaurants, a mediocre German restaurant. There was no fine dining. There were no ethnic restaurants. There were no boutique stores. You had a hardware store. You had a five and dime in Harvard Square. It was a very ordinary place outside the gates of Harvard Yard and the houses. Now you go to Cambridge, and you are in an upper middle class city, and not just an upper middle class city, but one which is incredibly densely populated with really, really smart people. So now you have a community in which you have not one, but two Whole Food stores within walking distance of Harvard Square. And you have, along with that, all of the ways in which people have developed a peculiar upper class culture. Peculiar in the way they raise their kids. They have very different reading habits from the rest of the country. They have very different television habits. The average TV in this country is on about 36 hours a week. And in the new upper class, except for Downton Abbey, they just don't watch television. That or Breaking Bad, perhaps, but they do not spend much time watching television. Is that a bad thing? No. Does it also mean, however, that this new upper class is cut off from mainstream American culture in important ways? Yes, it does. The same thing goes with their listening habits for radio, the movies they see, the vacations they take. There is a lifestyle which is way different from mainstream America. This is augmented by the second of the great forces I want to talk about, which is that the value of brains in the marketplace zoomed during the last half of the 20th century. There are a variety of examples of it. One of them, of course, has to do with the IT world and also has to do with the quantitative hedge funds, which provide for those with stratospherically high visual, spatial, and mathematical skills a path to wealth beyond the wildest dreams of avarice that simply did not exist for those people before. Furthermore, that it exists whether they have social skills or not. I'm sure you don't have anybody like this at Columbia, but I have in the past known people who were really, really smart in a visual spatial sense that I would not trust to walk across the street and buy me a loaf of bread. I mean, they just had no social skills, they had no common sense, but they are now juggling offers between Google and the quantitative hedge funds for stratospheric rewards. But it went across the occupational structure. It affected everything. Many of you saw Mad Men when it was on. All right, if you were Don Draper in 1960 and you could move market share by half a percentage point, you were worth a certain amount of money as a copywriter for an advertising firm if, say, the firm you were writing it for had annual revenues of $50 million. What are you worth if you can move market share half a point and the annual revenues of the firm are $15 billion? You are worth a lot more money than you were before. In part is simply the increase in the size of business organizations that made CEOs who were really good worth a lot more than they were before, made good financial officers worth a lot more than they were, makes lawyers worth a lot more than they used to be in certain kinds of specialties. In 1950, if you were an attorney, you were making a good living, but you weren't becoming a multimillionaire because the kinds of things that lawyers did seldom produced that kind of result that merited, multi-$100 per hour rates. Now, if you are a really cognitively adept lawyer who can navigate a regulation through the labyrinthine process in Washington, you can make a difference of hundreds of millions of dollars to the bottom line of a corporate client, and you are worth $1,000 an hour. If you can negotiate one of these incredibly complex multinational mergers, you can be worth a commission of several $1 million in a way you couldn't before. So now you have an elite which is not only much more highly selected for cognitive ability than it has been before, with the peculiar tastes and preferences associated with that, it is also an elite which is getting wealthier and wealthier. And you are all familiar, I'm sure, with the numbers on this, the way in which you have seen increases in national wealth over the last couple of decades be utterly dominated by the top few percentiles of the income distribution. So you have a new upper class that's really, really smart, and you have a new upper class that also has lots and lots of money, and they have a culture all their own. And guess what? By being separated from this culture, they also become ignorant of a lot of the realities that their fellow countrymen are facing, and their fellow countrymen notice this. Now, I've been talking about the ways in which people are isolated from mainstream America and the new upper class. And when I was trying to make that case in Coming Apart, I faced a problem of how do I convince my readers of that? Because there isn't a lot of good quantitative data that's available publicly. Now, Kettle Vodka knows exactly who its consumers are, and so does Mercedes-Benz, and all of these corporations know what their market is. And if I could get access to all of those data, I could have proven a lot of things about the isolation, but I couldn't get those data. So I developed what's called the bubble quiz. It has, by the way, been put online. If you want to take the bubble quiz, just Google NewsHour bubble quiz and it'll pop up. The NewsHour has put it up there, and I have 150,000 scores, along with the zip codes where these people lived, their age, and their zip codes when they were age 10. But let me give you a couple of examples of the questions in it, so you can see what the bubble quiz is measuring. There are some social sciencey questions, such as, have you ever lived a year of your life in a neighborhood where fewer than half of your neighbors had college degrees? Have you ever lived a year of your life below the poverty line? Graduate school, you do not get points for graduate school on that. Have you or your wife in the last year stocked your fridge with a mass market American beer? You think that's a frivolous question? It's a wonderful indirect indicator. The disdain of the new upper class for mass market American beer is palpable. It does not apply to undergraduates, but there are, however, it's turned out to be a really good test. I did it for heuristic purposes. As a teaching device, with my 140,000 scores, the correlation between the socioeconomic index for a zip code where they lived at age 10 and the bubble score is closing in on about 40%. I'm sorry, 0.4, which is a really substantial correlation in the social sciences. And it also forms a perfect normal distribution. But the questions in it that I think are most revealing and that I would be interested to know what the answers of the people in front of me are the following. The first is, have you ever walked on a factory floor? Not worked on a factory floor. Have you ever seen one? Everything that you have on, everything you use in daily life, just about, was made in a factory. If you've never even seen one, think of the degree to which you are closed off from a really important part of modern life. The other question I think is most important of all is, have you ever held a job that caused a body part to hurt at the end of the day? And I'm not limiting that statement to guys who work construction and they ache all over at the end of the day. I'm talking about somebody who's standing behind a counter all day and their feet hurt. That counts. If you have never held such a job, you are fundamentally unable to empathize with the millions upon millions of Americans who do hold such jobs, and the even larger percentage of them who have held the job at some point in their life and know what it's like. And this breeds also isolation and lack of understanding, and it breeds disdain. Flyover country. We used to call it the heartland. Now the new upper class calls it flyover country. And people in flyover country know what the new upper class is saying when they refer to it as such, and they don't particularly like it. Here's another thing you can try for yourself. It is a good thing, I am happy to say, that if you are at a polite dinner party and members of the new upper class, there is no ethnic slur that you can utter that will not provoke shock and immediate and probably very harsh pushback. That's good. There is, however, one exception. Test it out yourself. Just throw in the word redneck at some point, which is reasonably appropriate in a conversation, and see if you get any pushback. Bet you won't. Refer disparagingly to evangelical Christians. See if you get any pushback. Bet you won't. Those are the only slurs that you can use and get away with. And guess what? That gets noticed as well. Then you have a problem that is simply an empirical matter of making good policy. You know, there's an asymmetry. People sometimes say to me, yeah, but people in the working class are in just as much of a bubble as people in the new upper class. And that is true. But it doesn't make any difference if a truck driver in Oklahoma is not able to empathize with the priorities of a news anchor person or with the Secretary of Commerce. It makes a huge difference if a news anchor person or the Secretary of Commerce cannot empathize with the priorities of a truck driver in Oklahoma. That's what Donald Trump was able to capitalize on. It's a perfect theme of the campaign, and I do not want to put this in terms of a liberal versus conservative problem. I hang out all the time with conservatives, and I assure you that the problem of disdain in the conservative new upper class is a real one as well. It's not a matter of political ideology, I think, as it is generational. Ike Eisenhower's cabinet in 1952 and John Kennedy's cabinet in 1960 had one thing in common. Almost all the people in the cabinet were wealthy, but very few people in the cabinet were more than first generation money. Most of them were the sons of farmers. There were one or two women, but they were mostly sons. The one woman in Eisenhower's cabinet was the daughter of a lawyer in a little Texas town. Most of the rest of them were sons of farmers, of factory workers, of small shop owners, that kind of thing. You had a couple of patricians in each case, but that's all. So yeah, they were wealthy, but they still remembered what the little town in Texas was like. They still remembered what the factory town was like. They might be living in big houses and driving big cars at the time when they were adulthood, but they still knew what it was like. And furthermore, they had a very deep connection, and traditionally in America, a great pride in having come from those backgrounds. You advertised the fact that you came from humble origins. That was part of what made you a real American. And along with that is something that the older members of this audience, of whom there aren't very many, may remember and may seem like just hopelessly nostalgic to the younger ones. And that is, there was a very strong sense of the importance of seemliness if you had money or power or wealth. In Newton, Iowa, that was the home of the Maytag Company. No longer exists, but it was a Fortune 500 company when I was there. And the executives in the Maytag Company made plenty of money that if they'd wanted to build a 10,000 square foot house, they could have done so. If they wanted to buy a Cadillac, they easily could have done so. Nobody did. And the reason they didn't was that if they had done it, they would have been the object of shock and disapproval from everybody in town. They would have gotten too big for their britches. They would be lording it over their neighbors, and so they just didn't do it. When cars, they stopped at Buick. That was the end point for the best possible car you could buy and still get away with it. Furthermore, and again, this is not atypical of a lot of company towns in the United States, everybody was kind of mixed up together. The Murray family, my father was a mid-level executive in the Maytag Company, was a block and a half away from the house of Fred Maytag. And my wife was a block and a half in the other direction from Fred Maytag's house. And in that diameter, you had the sheriff, local sheriff lived, and his wife who gave piano lessons. You had a pharmacist. You had a factory worker across the street from us. You had a mix of people. That was not only true in places like Newton, Iowa. I accumulated data for Coming Apart in which I took 12 neighborhoods which, even in 1960, were already known as the place where rich and powerful people lived. Upper East Side of New York, Brookline, Massachusetts, Scarsdale, Beverly Hills, one of the suburbs of San Francisco, the North Shore of Chicago, and so forth, and computed the median family income and computed the percentage of people with BAs or better in those zip codes. On the Upper East Side of New York in 1960, the median income, I didn't go to the book and make sure I'm absolutely right in these numbers, but they're close. Median income was about $59,000 expressed in 2010 dollars. Median family income, Upper East Side of New York. And the percentage of people with college degrees was around 30%. What that means is not that you didn't have rich people living on Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue, you did, but the rest of the Upper East Side was a very different kettle of fish, much different environment. You did not have what you have now in Manhattan. What you have in Manhattan below 96th Street is essentially one great big super zip. Virtually all of the zip codes below 96th Street are in the top 5 percentiles and a whole bunch of socioeconomic status, and a bunch of them are in the top percentile and several of them are in the top half of the top percentile. Back in 1960, Manhattan was still a combination of an elite town, yeah, but also a working class town and a middle class town, and that was kind of all mixed up together. That's gone away as well. To move away from Manhattan, take the example of Washington, D.C. Those of you who know Washington, D.C., know where the movers and shakers live. They live in Northwest Washington, they live in McLean, Potomac, Great Falls, and a couple of zip codes in downtown D.C. There are really 11 of them that they're concentrated in. All but 2 of those are in the top half of the top percentile in socioeconomic status. There's a huge bubble in Washington, D.C. So you've got the isolation on the one hand, where people are living in neighborhoods with people just like them and they talk to each other. And you also have the money that goes into it, and the result is isolation and disdain. And the American working class and middle class recognize that, don't like it, angry about it, but something else was going on with them too. And that is, over this 50 years from 1960 to 2010, working class white America fell away from cultural norms that had persisted since the country was founded. I refer specifically to white America because I wanted to document this in a way in which my readers could not say, well, Murray is talking about actually a problem that's located primarily in the black community or the Latino community. I wanted them to have to face up to the fact that these problems are people, non-Latino whites. Here's the kind of thing I was looking at that was causing me a great deal of consternation. The first has to do with marriage. Marriage has a huge amount to do with the nature of the functioning of a community. That's not a conservative statement. That is a statement that those who studied social capital, Robert Putnam being among the leaders, that those who have studied the effects of families, Sarah McClanahan of Princeton being one of those who, both of whom are ironclad progressives. The things I'm saying they would agree with completely. Marriage is really important in determining how a community functions. It generates a great deal of the social capital. It has enormous effects on the way children are raised. It has enormous effects on the ability of the community to function. In 1960, if you define working class as people with no more than a high school education and working in a blue-collar or a low-level service job, the white working class ages 30 to 50, in the prime of life, 84% were married, 8-4. It was not quite as high as the upper middle class of whites, but it was really, really high. It was the organizational principle of a community. By 2010, that had dropped from 84% to 48%. That is an incredible drop on such a basic social institution in just 50 years. Meanwhile, among the upper middle class, it went from 94% to 84% in the same period. Not only that, divorce is dropping in the upper middle class. So you not only have a very high proportion of people still married, these are more and more often first and only marriages that they're occurring in. Huge divergence. An equally dramatic divergence occurred in terms of male labor force participation. In 1960, if you were an able-bodied male ages 30 to 50, and this was true across races, and you were not working or looking for work, you were a bum. And that was the word that was used. And it would be used by your girlfriend, it would be used by your parents, it would be used by your neighbors, it would be used by your male friends. It simply was not done to not be looking for work. And by the way, that applied to trust fund kids too. If you were sitting at home because you had wealthy parents and you had plenty of money and you weren't doing anything with your life, you were looked down on for that as well. So just about everybody was in the labor force, males. Over the next 50 years, in good times and bad, low employment, low unemployment or high unemployment, that labor force participation rate for males slowly, secularly declined. When I wrote the book using 2008 statistics from the current population survey, and I used 2008 because I wanted to use numbers that came before the Great Recession, you were up to about 12.5% of white males ages 30 to 50 who were out of the labor force, 1 out of 8. That is a profound change in the attitude toward work. When the book was published in 2012, I got some pushback on that, and people were saying, well, it's not really a change in the ethos, it's the job market, it's other things. Nobody now disputes that a huge change has taken place in the white working class. Just today, there were more articles published that drew from the data that Angus Deaton and Ann Case, two Princeton economists, he's a Nobel laureate, published a year or so ago, about the enormous rise in death rates among white working class from cirrhosis of the liver, from opioids, and from suicide. So white working class, males in particular, is one of the extremely rare groups in which life expectancy has been going down over the last 17 years. In fact, it is the only group for which life expectancy has been going down. There is a lot of time use data. Nick Eberstadt, my colleague at AEI, has written about this. What are these guys who aren't working? What are they doing? Mostly sitting at home, watching TV, playing video games, stoned. That's what they're doing. It is a breakdown of community that is disastrous. I don't want to overemphasize that in this following sense. I live in a town which is blue-collar, middle class, with a few oddballs like my wife and me. And we see both things going on. We see people who are still doing everything right, working hard, raising their kids carefully, doing a great job, but we also see this fraying at the edges that I've just talked about. Well, we now have Donald Trump, and we have him, I think, because of a revolt by the people I've just been talking about against a new upper class that they feel has let them down, has ignored them, is not sharing the fruits of increased wealth with them, and that most of all doesn't like them, doesn't respect them. And the result is a kind of class polarization the United States has not seen before. That leads me to the topic I want to close with, the meaning of the 2016 election as the end of America's creedal culture. The American creed is a phrase that was coined, interestingly enough, by Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish sociologist who wrote American Dilemma. But the American creed has been something that has been talked about, commented on, both by Americans themselves, but also foreign observers, whether it is Alexis de Tocqueville writing in the 1830s, or whether it's James Bryce writing The American Commonwealth in Britain in the late 19th century. And it can be expressed in a variety of ways. Samuel Huntington, the great political scientist who died about 10 years ago, his last book was entitled Who Are We? And he identified the three core elements of the American creed as freedom, individualism, and egalitarianism. Egalitarianism not in the social justice sense of that, Rawlsian sense of that term, but egalitarianism in the way I was talking about it before. This very strongly ingrained American notion that you may get rich, you may get powerful, but you still should be just one of the guys. And that was the way you were supposed to behave. Well, that American creed held firm across both political parties really up into the mid-1960s. Those of you who are old enough will remember Hubert Humphrey, probably the most liberal member of in American politics, holding a major position as of 1964. And he said of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that he would eat the bill in public if anyone could show him anything in the bill that prevented an employer from hiring or firing for any reason or no reason, as long as it didn't involve race. Now try to imagine a politician of either political party saying it should be possible for an employer to hire or fire for any reason or no reason. That's how far we've moved in one aspect of the American creed in our assumption about what the baseline is. But it's happened in a variety of other things as well. Essentially, By 1970, 1980, there were very few people in the Democratic Party who were talking about freedom and individualism and egalitarianism in the same way they were talking about it in 1960. They had an alternative rationale. It was very Rawlsian. It was based on social justice. It was in many ways drew from the traditions, intellectual traditions of the Western welfare states. I am not denigrating that. I'm just saying it was different, way different from what had formerly been a national consensus. Meanwhile, those of us on the right saw the election of Ronald Reagan, which was aided and abetted by large numbers of crossover Reagan Democrats, and limited government classical liberals like me said, well, this is great. It's a coalition, but it wins elections. And subsequently, it has continued to win a number of elections. But what people like me also ignored was the extent to which that all these votes which had come over from the working class were not of people who were devoted to limited government. And what happened in the campaign of 2016, to my shock and dismay, was to realize that even though I had come to terms with the fact that the left had drifted away from the American creed, I now had to accept that a very large proportion of the right was not attached to the American creed. And actually, to a lot of you, I imagine the audience, for me to even talk about the American creed has an anachronistic sound to it. We are that far removed from it. Why is this a bad thing? Well, it's not a bad thing. First place, all of you won't think it's a bad thing, but the reason I think it's a bad thing is not because I think America is the best country in the world to live in. I lived very happily in Thailand for 6 years. I am very happy to go visit Europe. I could make a very happy life for myself in Sweden and the Netherlands, for heaven's sakes, let alone in Italy or England or France. No, it's not that. It is that the United States was unique. Our civic culture was unique in all the world. There were a variety of ways in which it was unique. The degree to which we formed voluntary associations to solve problems, the degree to which people who happened to live in physical proximity to each other, as opposed to being members of an extended family, worked together was unique. You have lots of cultures in the world with wonderful traditions of hospitality to strangers. But the number of cultures in which people in physical proximity to each other just naturally cooperate with each other, that's pretty rare. And one of the most wonderful features of all was the egalitarian, the strong egalitarian ideal. If you're saying, did the United States always live up to this? Am I saying that we didn't have oppression of blacks? Am I saying that we did not have oppression of women? No, I'm not saying that. I'm talking about characteristics of the United States that were really terrific and that were unique. And if they go away, it's like the last dodo bird dying, you know? It's extinct. And that kind of makes me sad. I guess it's encapsulated in a way by an episode that happened a year and a half ago when I was up at Harvard, speaking actually to the American Enterprise Institute's Executive Council up at Harvard. And I was told during the course of the meal that the people who had paid for it, sponsored it, were in the restaurant. And so I went over to introduce myself to them. They were a couple, I would imagine in their early 40s probably. He was in finance. And they said that they had read Coming Apart, and they had read my exhortations to get out of the bubble and to become more in touch with mainstream America, and that they had decided that I was right, and they had sold their place in Greenwich, Connecticut, and moved to some little town elsewhere in Connecticut, which was, you know, the working class slash middle class town that I told them they ought to go to. And I think that my face was probably getting a little pale. And I wanted to say to them, it was only a book, you didn't have to do this. And then they said, and it's been great. We love it. And I guess that's kind of my message to Columbia students, that I love this traditional American culture. I don't want to lose it, There are no social policies that are going to bring it back. There's no laws that can be passed. It's only going to be preserved if people like you, when you become successful and are making a lot of money, do not move to Greenwich just because you can afford it. Do not move to Atherton if you're in Silicon Valley just because you can afford it. That instead you go live in a place where you have a really lovely home, you have all the amenities. I'm not asking you to be self-sacrificing. I'm just saying get out of this claustrophobic class that we live in, because maybe you'll love it. And in the process, learn to love America in a way which has been sadly reduced in recent years. So that is a completely impractical, idealistic solution to something that I imagine many of you don't even think is a problem. But I think the loss of the America I describe and those unique qualities would be a tragedy, because what we had was immeasurably precious. Thank you. Number one.
Hi. You mentioned earlier that when you were writing Coming Apart, you had trouble figuring out how to convince your readers of your argument because you didn't have access to the data that you thought would be helpful. Sorry? All right. If you didn't have access to this data, how did you know yourself that your argument that you were trying to form was accurate?
Because I live in both worlds. I work at the American Enterprise Institute. I hang out all the time professionally with people who are part of the new upper class. When one mic starts working, the other mic stops working. Anyway, it's a small room. So I am thoroughly, in fact, and I also live with many of these same habits that I was talking about. There are studies that talk about socioeconomic differences in child rearing patterns, for example. The term helicopter parent developed because of upper middle class parenting habits. There are fragmentary data on, well, there are data I could collect, for example, on such things as what kinds of cars the new upper class drives versus mainstream America. I could go to parking lots and I could count the number of proportion of foreign cars in a parking lot at a Whole Foods store in Chevy Chase, and I could go out to Brunswick to the train parking lot where people commute into DC for their middle class jobs and do the same kind of thing. But mostly, I winged it. And may I say that if I produced a quiz which is correlated between socioeconomic status of the zip code, correlates at about 0.4 with my bubble score, I did a pretty good job in that regard.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is awkward. Hello, Dr. Murray. Thank you
Hi.
for being here today. I'm going to read my question.
Sure.
In your comments, you said that it doesn't matter if a person in a rural community can't empathize with the elites. It only matters that the elites can empathize with those in the rural communities. Mm-hmm. As the power of misogynistic and racist organizations like the alt-right rise, it makes that claim that so-called elites are only guilty of isolation and disdain ring incredibly hollow. Similarly, you said that the rise of Donald Trump was a reaction by the people to a new upper class who neither dislike nor respect them. Yet to hear the disdain with which some small-town folks talk about social justice warriors and so on shows that the feelings are sometimes mutual. Which brings me to my question. Why, in your estimation, is it acceptable for only the elites to have to seek out exiting their bubble and entering the rural communities, while those in the rural communities have somewhat of a pass where they're able to maintain their value systems and not look outside of their current belief system to understand how the rest of the country lives? Thank you. I'll take my questions.
I think the first answer to your question is simply the practical one that I've alluded to in the talk, which is the elite holds the power. So my long-haul truck driver in Oklahoma that I was talking about, his life is decisively changed by what the Department of Energy or the Department of Commerce or other place decides are going to be regulations that really affect his life, his family's life in very serious ways. So as a practical matter, you better have an elite that is knowledgeable. Furthermore, and I hope I said this clearly, you shouldn't, if you're part of the elite, you should not mingle with the rest of mainstream America for abstract reasons. You should do it in part because your life will be a lot richer. My sense is that the new upper class has gotten very good at living glossy lives, but their lives don't have a whole lot of texture to them. It's kind of hard to get engaged in the stuff of life if you're living in a community that's on 2 or 3 acre lots and everybody around you is making $250,000 a year minimum. I mean, yeah, you still have organizations in those communities and you still have parents who get together in the schools, but you're really skating over the surface of, I think, the stuff of life, of sharing in life's importance events. So I'm saying to the new upper class, the reason you ought to do this is for your own good. Now, as for the mainstream America and why they don't get out of their bubble, I'm afraid if you go ask them that question, they would say, you give me $250,000 a year, I'll go see what your bubble's like. I'd be happy to do so. They don't have the option. I just got to give one more example, though. Clive Crooks is a well-known journalist. He used to be with the Financial Times. Now I think he's with Bloomberg. He bought a weekend place out in West Virginia near the Shenandoah River. And he gets out there. He is the image of the bubble guy. You know, he's a journalist. He's a Brit. He's got the British aristocratic accent. He's got degrees. He's all this stuff. He's famous. He was received with great warmth. He was not received as an outsider. They did not say, well, you must be a pointy-headed intellectual. They have been great neighbors to him. He loves them. When he said to his neighbors in Georgetown, because that's where he lives, that he had bought a place for the weekend in West Virginia, his friends in Georgetown talked about it as if, well, these are all people out of deliverance, you know, snagging teeth and committing atrocious acts and dumb and all that. And they said this, Clive related to this, he said, it's just amazing. Degree, first, it was so general, and second, the language they used was so completely contemptuous. Is there an alt-right out there which is terrible, which is racist? Absolutely. I'm a never Trumper, and when I tweeted anything about Trump that was critical, I would get feedback that just was vile. So you're right that that exists. To identify mainstream America with that is simply wrong. You are talking about good people. They aren't sexist, they aren't racist, they aren't homophobes, they're good people, and to identify what I think is a very small minority of them with the whole, with all respect, I think that's a huge mistake.
Weird. Okay. Hi, thanks for coming. My question actually looks a little bit into the future, but it's a current issue that we're going to have to confront. What happens when automation takes on a greater role in the traditionally lower skilled areas of operation? In your opinion, is that going to exacerbate the differences? And if it does, how do we brook that chasm?
You have raised what is, in my view, the most important single problem facing us down the road. Not in 5 years, but in 15, 20, 25. Well, the thing that we can see right now is that you don't want to plan on a career as a truck driver because those jobs are going to be gone quite soon. But it's much worse than that because the real job losses, the real hollowing out of the job market is going to be in white-collar jobs Because right now we have lots and lots of white-collar jobs that call for a reasonable amount of intelligence. You don't have to be a genius, but you have to be able to make judgments about complicated things. But they're routinized complicated things. You know, you aren't creating a new law of physics or anything. You are doing things that fall within a fairly narrow range of complication. The software for making those judgments is getting better and better and better and better. AI has been oversold for years, it's been hyped for years, and I am convinced, and this is certainly not original with me, lots of other people have made this point, we are now starting up that exponential curve. You now have software that can do all sorts of routine management jobs. You're soon going to have routine paralegal jobs. But the examples or the example that really gives me pause is what happened with the machine that beat the Go champion. Go is the Japanese game. It's much more complicated than chess to program a computer for. As a few years ago, they were saying it was going to be a decade before they had a computer that could beat a serious Go player. Actually, last spring, a computer program beat one of the best players in the world 4 games out of 5. Here's the scary thing. The program was not taught how to play Go. The program was fed a whole bunch of past Go games, move by move, thousands of them, whereupon the computer, and was given the rules of Go, the objective of Go, and then the computer played millions and millions and millions and millions of games against itself and taught itself to be the best Go player in the world. Taught itself. Okay, that's a generalizable accomplishment in AI. We are going to have, I am convinced, and I'm talking maybe 2030, 2035, 2040, an unprecedented job market in the United States where there simply will not be 40-hour-a-week jobs of the kind we've had before for all the people who would ordinarily want them. And we are going to have a massive recalibration of what living a meaningful life is in terms of work, and we're going to have to move much closer for males to what has in the past been a female model, which is to say, my wife, by her own choosing, has been what is called a stay-at-home mom. She's busy from morning till night with the Literacy Council, with the South Mountain Heritage Society, Quaker meeting. She's doing what Bob Putnam would be very proud of. She's building social capital. Guys traditionally have not felt fulfilled if they didn't have a real job, and have not thought that that kind of life was satisfying. Well, it is, but men are going to have to get used to the idea it's satisfying, because that's going to be one of the main sources in which they can live fulfilling lives. Huge problem down the road.
Hi, I'm one of those vile feedback guys you were talking about earlier. And I can't remember exactly what your tweet was, but it was right when Trump was starting, and you got mad at him for saying whom or who wrong, or it was some sort of grammar mistake or something, and it just sounded so aristocratic that you were disgusted. It was Oxford comma, it was something hoity-toity. And I know Coulter, and Coulter said this too, we both sort of went, what happened to our coming apart guy? Like, I thought Trump was the ultimate coming apart dude, and the whole Make America Great Again is getting back to this 1950s America, and then you were coming across on Twitter as this erudite academic who saw him as lower class.
Well, I don't remember that tweet. I do know what I am upset at Trump about for then and now, and I said it. You know the thing, well, okay, I know a number of people, because AEI has a board of trustees who has lots of CEOs, lots of people who are in New York, lots of people who've dealt with Trump. Here is what they tell me, and these are men who I trust and believe. They say, you cannot do business with this man with a handshake. And these are men who like to do business with a handshake. Make a settle in principle and then give it to the lawyers and let them work it out. You cannot do business with Trump as a handshake. He will not keep his word. He will stiff subcontractors as a business model. It's what he does routinely, and when he stiffs them for the last 30% of what he owes them, his lawyers say to the subcontractor, well, yeah, you can fight it, and by the time you're done, you're going to have spent so much more in legal fees, you just better settle. He's done that for years. That he is a man without principle. All of these things are not me thinking he's a vulgarian and he doesn't use correct English and all that. I think he is a despicable man. That's my opinion. And that kind of person, I don't care whether he's blue collar, I don't care whether he's white collar, I don't care whether he's a billionaire, he's despicable. That's what I'm going to say about him.
Thank you very much for coming out. I have my questions in regards to the difference between President Eisenhower and President Kennedy's time and our time now. During the time of Eisenhower and Kennedy, a large proportion of the elites had served in the military or their family members had perished in the Great Wars. How is that functionally different to today, and how does that impact today's society?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong that couldn't be fixed by another world war. In a sense, you know, people will point out to me what a great mixer the military was for bringing people together, and it's absolutely true. The thing is, that's not applicable to what we have now because we simply will not have, and even if we brought back the draft, what are we talking about? A couple of 100,000 people a year maybe, at most, that would be affected by that, so you're not really going to make a dent in the kind of isolation we're talking about. Other people say, well, how about doing national service as a way of comparably bringing people together? You'll have the same thing happen with that happened with Occupy Wall Street, whereby within a few days after you had the occupied grounds, they'd settled into Belmont and Fishtown, you know, where you had one group that were the college guys, another group who were the working stiffs. But it would be worse than that because if it were compulsory national service, it would be civilian, which means that the administrators of those programs could not use the Uniform Code of Military Justice to force unwilling volunteers to toe the line, and it would become a case of gaming the system, and I think probably would increase problems as opposed to diminish them. Yeah?
So my question is, because at Columbia we have 350 undergraduate veterans plus probably about 500 across the board here. As well, but the other Ivy League institutions and other top schools generally are reluctant and have cohorts of veterans in ones and twos, if that, at some of these institutions. Is there any sort of impetus on your level that you see at your highest esteemed academic level of bringing more people who have served in the military into these institutions?
First place, the best answer is I don't know. I've never heard of any such impetus. No.
Hi. When you made the description of the increase in opioid deaths and liver-related illness deaths, the first image that came into my mind was that of post-Soviet Russia and the associated sociological issues that concern that. And one of the impressions I got generally from your talk is that the decline of the of what you called the American Creed had I think you used the reference of the extinction of the dodo bird as this sort of cute thing that would go away. Do you see any more sort of hard or material consequences that could happen as a result of this coming apart?
You know, I was giving a lecture which I have given in similar form many times, but sometimes to try to keep things interesting, I've just say something that flashed into my mind, so I'd never used the last dodo bird before. And as soon as it was out of my mouth, I said, I'm not sure that's exactly the impression I was trying to convey. Other consequences of the coming apart? In a way, no. In a way, I think the United States can continue to be as militarily powerful, as economically powerful as it is now in a society that no longer has the unique characteristics that I referred to. The difference will be that we will be finally like Europe, and which is something devoutly to be wished by a lot of people at elite colleges. But when they say like Europe, I don't think they quite are including the thing I have in mind, which is, you know, German intellectuals feel much more kinship with French intellectuals and British intellectuals than they feel with German farmers. And God knows French intellectuals are not well known for their affection for French peasants. The United States, the faculty at Columbia has intellectual contacts all around the world. They're constantly going abroad to conferences and so forth, which is fine, except that I think that America's new upper class, and by the way, the same is true of America's new upper class in business and other fields, I think that we feel more in common with people of our class in Europe than we feel with mainstream America. And that is a way of resembling Europe that I find very depressing. But I think it's happening. It's happening. But we won't go away. America won't go away. We'll do fine economically. We just won't be America anymore.
Thanks so much for the talk. I immigrated from Germany 9 years ago and then came to Columbia here in New York. And I'm wondering to what extent you think, I came mainly, I wanted always to come to America for the exceptionalism, for this kind of way of life, not necessarily militarily, but like this thinking we want to be at the top. And then I also, during the talk, thought of this clip from, I think, the show Newsroom, where the guy says, well, we're no longer number one in anything, right? We're number 7 here, and number 14 there, and number 35 in this list. So we're no longer number one. And I do think that in the elites, there's this sense, well, we should be happy in somewhere, maybe in the top 15 somewhere. Whereas like, make America great again is the sentiment, no, we should be number one. And I do think there is a mismatch, and also this affinity to Europe. And do you think that what would be a good vision for a positive exceptionalism, one where we want to be number one without having to control everything, maybe?
Well, I guess that I would go back and say at the peak of the kinds of characteristics of our civic culture that I'm applauding, what is it that would drive Europeans crazy when Americans went abroad? It wouldn't be, if I'm talking about 1900, from reading literature and so forth, because the Europeans did talk about what they found objectionable about Americans and that sort of thing. Americans were not boasting about how rich we were. They weren't boasting about how powerful we were. They were boasting about the American way of life. And the American way of life was freedom, individualism, and egalitarianism. So, in a way, wanting to be number one is already different from what used to characterize America. It's closer to nationalism. It's closer to nationalism. And that has been creeping up over the last several years, long before Trump. It certainly felt to me as if boasting about America was increasingly based on number one and much less based on our unique way of life. So don't worry about making America number one. Worry about making the American way of life alive and well.
Hi, Dr. Murray. My question is about the role of pop culture, and especially with bringing back the creed that you're talking about. I think that Andrew Breitbart said that culture is downstream of politics, and I think it's an incredibly key insight into
culture is the what?
It's downstream from politics.
Downstream.
Or sorry, politics is downstream from culture. Yeah. And I think it's a really, truly important insight that he was able to key in on. And I think that if it's not the reason for the destruction of the creed, it was the vehicle through which the elites have destroyed that creed over the last 40 years. And I'm wondering if you think that it can reverse, if it's pop culture, whether it's cinema, a Jon Stewart of the right, something like that, can bring America back together again.
Well, okay, we got to break this up pretty soon. Actually, I'm going to give an extended answer to this question, and so I guess we better make this the last question because we're at 8:10 already. Can we bring America back again? Good signs are, when I talk about this issue, with most audiences, with a lot of audiences, I see a lot of heads nodding and agreeing with me. I'll tell you what really I get audiences nodding, and that's a couple of times I've spoken to wealthy audiences, but and I've talked about, well, what about your kids? To what extent are you systematically depriving your kids of the experiences that made you who you are by living in this bubble? To what extent are you depriving? And I get lots of people agreeing with that. I had the example of the couple that read Coming Apart and moved out of Greenwich. These anecdotes? Yeah, but is there real residual affection for the kind of America I described? And I think that answer is yes. Now, suppose that's true. Suppose there is an affection for that. Suppose that's quite widespread, that cuts across party lines, and that essentially it only needs to be voiced in order for it start to get in the air. Then I go back and I look at America's history of religious great awakenings. There were either 3 or 4, depending on whether you believe the historian that says there's 4. But the first was in the 18th century, early part of the 18th century. The second was the early part of the 19th century. Third was in the last part of the 19th century. And in each case, these were extremely powerful religious great awakenings. They came out of nowhere, from no clear cause. They were entirely independent of government, and they had sweeping effects on the culture, which relates to politics being downstream from culture. The civil rights movement was a different kind of civic great awakening. When you get serious about it, the civil rights movement was pretty much at a standing start in 1954, about the time of Rosa Parks and Brown versus Board of Education. There had been civil rights movement, but it hadn't gotten much traction. And within 10 years, you had Congress passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's an incredible sort of changed consciousness over a very short period of time. So I can imagine a civic great awakening where all at once people who build 15,000 square foot houses are looked down on. All at once that people who are too big for their britches and flaunt their money and are disdainful of fellow Americans will get pushed back. That at that dinner party when you say redneck, somebody is going to say to you, you know, what the hell do you mean by redneck anyway? That's possible. Do I think the odds favor it? Probably not, but it's possible. That's the closest that I can come to optimism, and on that note, I will close it. Thank you very much, everybody.